Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us for an Affinity Summit on a comprehensive eviction prevention strategy in Pennsylvania, creating partnerships, presented at Homes Within Reach 2021. Very glad to have all of you with us, and just by way of introduction, a little bit of housekeeping. We are immersed in day 3 of the Homes Within Reach conference. And following the morning sessions, there are 2 afternoon session blocks, one from 1 to 2 p.m., the other from 2:15 to 3:15. A few of the sessions that are coming up, although there are many great ones to choose from, include navigating resources for COVID-19, diversion prevention and rapid exit, housing survivors of domestic violence, and landlord-tenant mediation lessons from the ground. After the last session, there will be networking group discussions from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. You can just choose to jump right into any of those. Each will have a moderator. I will be moderating the coordinated entry networking group, but there will also be ones on blight, community development programs, rental assistance, health and housing, and many, many more. So please check out the conference agenda and join your peers and colleagues in one of those sessions to end today's conference. Turning to this morning's summit, I'm Jason Alexander. I'm a principal and co-founder of Capacity for Change. We provide strategy consulting and technical assistance to continuums of care, public-private partnerships, and organizations that are all working to end and prevent homelessness in Pennsylvania. And of course, one of the greatest threats of our current moment of our time for our sector and our communities is the threat of eviction for people living in poverty, people experiencing an unexpected job loss or personal crisis, and as well as the
Hi, this is Jennifer Lopez from Friends Association. It seems like we're having some technical difficulties with Jason's video and audio. So we are in this session to talk with people across Pennsylvania and even from out of state about eviction prevention and their work around it and best practices. So we're going to start off talking about our individual work in eviction prevention. And I'm going to ask Lauren to unmute and introduce herself and share with us her work.
Thank you, Jennifer. So happy to be here today. My name is Lauren Lowry. I'm the program director for housing and community development at National League of Cities. National League of Cities is a national organization that serves over 19,000 cities, towns, and villages across the United States and 49 state municipal league. And with my work, I particularly focus on fulfilling 2 buckets, one ending homelessness and ending housing instability. And over the last year, my team has been doing deep work in eviction prevention. We've used a 2-pronged strategy where we have developed blogs, webinars, guidance, fact sheets to list recommendations from eviction data to implementing long-term strategies such as eviction mediation, as well as eviction diversion strategies. And also over the last 12 months, we've been working with the Stanford Legal Design Lab by implementing a eviction prevention cohort, where we worked with cities across the United States, including Norfolk, Virginia, and Richmond, Virginia. We worked with Grand Rapids, Michigan, as well as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And over the last 6 months working with these cities, we have not only been providing timely content and technical assistance about eviction and their local eviction crisis, but we've also added a layer about COVID. And so we were responding to the on-the-ground crisis around COVID-19. Thank you, Jennifer.
You're so welcome. Thank you for that national perspective. Now going to a local perspective, I'm going to ask Sue to unmute. Sue is the program administrator at Good Shepherd Mediation.
Thank you, Jennifer. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm the program administrator at Good Shepherd Mediation Program. We are a Philadelphia-based community justice center. We've been around for, I think, about 36 years now, providing mostly community-based mediation services. So we're available to mediate pretty much any kind of conflict you can think of, whether it's neighbor dispute, co-workers, custody. We do a lot of custody work. Landlord-tenant, we've been doing that for quite some time. We also do provide a range of facilitation services for larger groups. We do a lot of training and consulting, and we also offer a range of restorative justice practices. As far as our eviction prevention work, in the fall of 2019, the city of Philadelphia received a small grant and issued an RFP to create a pre-filing landlord-tenant mediation program. And we applied and we were selected for that pilot project. And the reason that Philadelphia wanted to do this was it was the result of some recommendations from a previously created mayor's task force on eviction prevention. Philadelphia experiences somewhere in the order of 20,000 eviction filings in any given year. You know, that's an approximate number. And one of the many problems with just a landlord filing in court to start the process of eviction is that very filing creates what's known as a stain on the tenant's record, so that it can be harder for that person to secure rental housing in the future, regardless of the outcome of the eviction. That was the impetus for the pre-filing nature of the program. So that started in the fall of the very, very late fall of 2019. We were working on that. We were moving forward with that. And then March 2020, the pandemic hit. We shifted gears almost immediately to provide those landlord-tenant mediations online. And we were doing that for a while. Then, and as you might imagine, the courts in Philadelphia were all closed for at that point, nobody really knew how long the courts would be closed for. Then in the summer, in anticipation of the courts opening on September 1st, the city of Philadelphia City Council passed an ordinance called the Emergency Housing Protection Act, which created, and among other things, this act created an eviction diversion program, which provides an opportunity for landlords and tenants to mediate the issues before the landlord files an eviction complaint. So again, it's a pre-filing diversion program. And this diversion mediation program is very narrowly targeted to the possibility of eviction in cases where there's been either non-payment or missed rent because of a COVID-related financial hardship. So the landlord accesses a city portal, requests the mediation. A number of behind the scenes things happen. we set up we schedule a mediation. The ordinance requires that we do that that we offer a mediation date within 30 days so as not to hold up the landlord for too long before they file if there's no agreement. And we hold the mediations because of the, boom, 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 let's get this done nature of the project. We're holding the mediations by phone instead of Zoom, also partly because of the inaccessibility of Zoom for a lot of our population here in Philadelphia. And we've done, hundreds of mediations by now. We do anywhere from 50, 60, 70 mediations a week using volunteer mediators who we trained. The last thing I'll say before I end is this eviction diversion program would not be possible were it not for the fact that it is a partnership, a really strong partnership between the city of Philadelphia, ourselves, legal services organizations, housing counseling agencies who assist the tenant and the landlord-tenant team, I guess I could say, in figuring out ways to make the landlord whole and to keep the tenant housed. Thanks.
So I think we'll finish the community presentations and then go back to the intro and start the conversation. Kyle, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, my name is Kyle Webster. I am General Counsel of Action Housing. Action Housing is the largest and oldest affordable housing nonprofit in Pennsylvania. We are based and do most of our work in the Pittsburgh greater metro area with a heavy focus on Allegheny County, though we do have a presence in a variety of counties throughout Western Pennsylvania. We do real estate development, property management, provide a number of resources. We ran the Allegheny County and Armstrong rent relief programs through the CARES Act. We also are involved heavily in HEMAP, mortgage counseling. We do lead abatement programs that we administer for the county. We do a variety of other things. We own a couple of low barrier / homeless shelters type facilities, a lot of SROs, and we are, I believe, one of the largest nonprofit LIHTC developers in the state. In the specific eviction prevention space, as General Counsel of Action Housing, I have kind of the unique position of being an attorney who is both a tenant advocate and a landlord, which I think brings a unique perspective and has kind of put me at a lot of tables to assist with policy. I assisted with the creation of the housing court that launched last year in Allegheny County. I've also been a part of actually the National League of Cities convened a group of eviction prevention folks here in Allegheny County around Pittsburgh. And I've assisted with a lot of different things in that nature. Also in the time of COVID, everyone does different things at nonprofits, and I was put in charge of our mortgage and rent relief departments. So I actually directly oversaw the implementation of the rent relief programs that we administered. And I'm also, in a different vein, I'm also on the board of Just Mediation, which is our local eviction prevention and intervention mediation program that just launched here in the last year. I'm one of the founding board members of that. And I'm also involved with a number of other kind of conversations in that space. I find myself often in eviction prevention spaces, which are heavily tenant right advocate focused. And I think that I have the unique perspective of being often the only person at the table who has actually evicted someone. As General Counsel of Action Housing, I do handle our more complicated evictions. We are a nonprofit. We have 25 to 3,500 units under our umbrella. So we do at times have to evict. And when they get more complicated, legal does step in and assist with those. So I have both acted very much as a tenant advocate, but I have also been the attorney that actually led to a successful eviction, which I think brings a unique perspective. That's basically who I am and what we do. So I will pass it on to Jason / Jennifer.
Thanks, Kyle. I am Jennifer Lopez, the Executive Director of Friends Association in Chester County. I want to thank the Housing Alliance for putting this together and inviting me to speak and share about our program, which is fairly new and compared to all of our other panelists. A little bit about Friends in Chester County, and then I'll jump into our eviction prevention court. Friends is a nonprofit serving families through shelter and prevention programs. We have a history, the agency is almost 200 years old. We have a long history of transitional housing, bridge programs, and we've been providing emergency shelter to families since 1982. We are located in Chester County, which is a suburb of Philadelphia and Wilmington. Our population is a little over 500,000, and our county covers almost 800 square miles. Chester County has been named the fastest growing county in Pennsylvania and in the Southeast region. It also has the highest income in Pennsylvania and the 24th highest in the nation. But a single mom with one child would need to earn $52,000 annually to afford to live in Chester County. That's 356% above the federal poverty level. So while we have $1 million listings, we have community members living in abject poverty. In 2010, Friends focused our mission on housing. We continued to provide shelter, adopted the Housing First model, began prevention and housing stability case management programs. And then this year, 2020, we were awarded funding to open the first reentry home focused on reunifying moms with their children after incarceration. And in September, we started the county's first eviction prevention court. We really believe that the best way to reduce and end people being unhoused is to prevent it from happening in the first place. So in April of 2020, Friends convened a group of stakeholders to identify opportunities to address the looming eviction crisis that we all knew was headed our way. The group included judges, attorneys, legal aid representatives, county officials, at least one expert with a link to Jason, and landlords. So we were prepared at that first meeting with our local data, which was hard to come by. But we found that in 2019, there were over 2,500 landlord-tenant filings across the 17 district courts in Chester County and almost 900 orders of possession. So as a result, we agreed to a series of action steps, and the Chester County Eviction Prevention Pilot Court was launched in September 2020 in the Downingtown District Court, which was the court with the most number of filings. So the project serves both individuals and families by providing access to staff trained in local landlord-tenant law, free legal services, and attorney on site, access to financial assistance and social service support and connections for ongoing support. Through the project, we implemented a number of court process changes that included adding additional information to the court summons about the program services that were available through Friends Association, scheduling landlord-tenant matters on one day of the week. Most of the courts kind of scheduled them as they came in. So the Downingtown court picked one day to schedule, and the court made on-site meeting space available to our staff and our attorney. We did not do this in a vacuum. We had a lot of community partners helping. The Chester County court system and the judges were phenomenal. We had a liaison judge with the Court of Common Pleas that kind of served as our connector with the district courts. Our Department of Community Development, the United Way, all kind of pitched in to help us. So with the success of the Downingtown pilot in September, we've been operational since that time. We expanded on January 4th to 2 additional courts serving the city of Coatesville and surrounding areas. These 3 courts constituted almost a third of the filings countywide and over 1/3 of the evictions countywide in 2019. So we implemented the same court process changes. The courts agreed to consolidate calendars to one day. So we're in the courts in the morning, and that same day we appear in the second court in the afternoon. And we really hope to demonstrate that this approach is scalable for the entire county and that the lessons we learned from this work can inform state and national approaches to eviction prevention. At the end of the day, we know what we've always known. People are struggling, they're underemployed, they don't have benefit packages, They don't have paid time off. They don't have childcare. They're underinsured. They don't have insurance. They have a vehicle breakdown, and the pandemic has just magnified all of this. Our plan is to continue to get our feet under us with these courts, and then begin on advocacy. To Sue's point, we want to add an agreement to expunge the filing from the tenant's record as part of the settlement agreement, because that still stays on regardless of the outcome. We also want to allow an affidavit of compliance with the agreement to be submitted by the tenant or the landlord. Typically it's the landlord that has to submit something to say that, the case can be dismissed as the conditions of the agreement have been met. And sometimes they're not incentivized to file this. So we're hard at work. We've seen a range of families and individuals who, this is directly a result of COVID, to families and individuals that were struggling pre-COVID, and this just made it worse. So we're hoping to, again, expand to additional courts and then take on some of the advocacy roles that are needed long-term. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. I guess my role is to raise the bar on embarrassing and awkward things that can happen on Zoom. But I just want to go back before we dive into our conversation and provide a little bit more context. And there's already some questions coming in, and I do want to encourage you to use the question feature. And we're gonna weave in your questions throughout. We're not going to save them for the end. And the first question is probably while you were talking about some of your innovative projects, questions around whether we can get a written summary of the steps to starting something like an eviction prevention court in someone's community. And so we'll tap into the Housing Alliance staff and network to make sure that any materials that our presenters can share, they can either reference through the chat or get out through the Housing Alliance after our presentation. And that really is the point of this morning's affinity session, is not only to discuss the challenges, some of the underlying root cause issues and equity issues related to eviction and eviction prevention, but also what are the innovative solutions that are happening right here in the Commonwealth, and how can other communities learn about, replicate, and figure out how to successfully implement and fund projects that make sense for their communities, whether they're large municipalities, entire counties, rural areas, suburban communities, or a mix. And so we have a good, I think, eclectic mix of experts who are going to help us learn more about that. Just a little bit of additional context on eviction. There is, if you're not familiar with Eviction Lab, it is a website where you can search any municipality anywhere in the United States and anywhere in the Commonwealth, from Coatesville to Carlisle, and identify eviction information. This is information from 2016, so it's pre-COVID, of course. But these rankings, these numbers, 81, 88, 102, 188, those are the rankings of the eviction rates for all US cities. And these are just some highlights of eviction rates, both evictions and per year. And these are the 4 highest for cities in Pennsylvania. But you can go in and search any city, large or small, and get some information from Eviction Lab. So we're going to get some updated information today from some of our presenters. And of course, there's a distinction between filings and actual evictions. But this just provides a little bit of contextual data on evictions rates in Pennsylvania, and a really good resource for you. What are the reasons people are being evicted? If you're not familiar with this report linked, we will again share these slides and links, but the University of Minnesota did a really incredible research study in 2018. The entire report is published online, of evictions, causes, rates, and solutions in northern Minneapolis. So this is just a snapshot infographic of reasons for non-payment of rent. And I think you probably will nod your head yes, that these are the reasons for non-payment of rent throughout any community, starting with the highest being poverty and unexpected job loss, or decreased income, or lack of resources, followed by disputes with landlords, followed by trauma experienced by households, domestic violence and other trauma, health crisis, death of close family or friends. And then in a smaller number, conduct on premise, not simple non-payment of rent. And then finally, a little bit of housing programs failing to pay rent on behalf of households. So many of the reasons most of them are economic, but then there's a health element and there's a legal element. And finally, just the third piece of context, we often discuss this anecdotally, but data really should be driving a lot of our insights and decision making. We will be talking about that with our experts today, but it is important, and this is an excerpt from an Aspen Institute study of the COVID impact on the eviction crisis and from 2020. And just confirming, I think, what many of us know, which is that eviction risk disproportionately impacts communities of color and renters with children. And so, again, if you click through to this report, there is a great deal of data and information nationally on some eviction and eviction prevention trends. So just a little bit of context about the depth and the severity of the issue. And now we're going to move into a roundtable forum with our four experts here, and you've already met them. So I think we'd like to start with talking about some of the lessons learned about eviction prevention through the forced lens of the pandemic, which has really changed the landscape in 2020 over evictions with the moratorium. An additional lens or magnified lens that the COVID-19 pandemic has placed on equity issues and disparities in housing and homelessness, including homelessness prevention and eviction prevention, and trying to launch some of these innovative strategies and also wrestle with the complexity of landlords, tenants, funding, while we're experiencing a crisis. So Jen, if you could maybe start with some of the lessons learned through the work you've been doing through the pandemic.
Sure. I will say this. I mean, we don't know anything other than pandemic. We started it, started the planning, secured the funding, got the courts started in the midst of a pandemic. I think that the pandemic served to bring this issue to the forefront nationally. I think we knew, all of us in this field have known for eons the eviction crisis and the impact that it has on individuals and families. And I will say the pandemic probably made it a little bit easier for us to get the cooperation of the courts. Because they knew they were going to be inundated, and to get the funding that we needed to start this. Everybody just kind of jumped in. The lessons that we learned are, we have to focus on diversion. Sometimes by the time the tenants are defending against eviction, it's too late to preserve that landlord-tenant relationship and the housing situation. So in many cases, the move out, whether it's a court order or part of a settlement, is hard to avoid. And we have had to do quite a few of those. So trying to figure out extending time and getting someone to move out in the midst of a pandemic is challenging. So we need to create interventions earlier in the process, like Sue's program, pre-filing, before the renter is summoned to court. And I think there's some research out there that says that landlords typically wait about 60 days after the first missed rental payment to file an eviction action. And that's a critical window of time where we can intervene with a problem-solving approach. I will say that we've seen that time shortened. I think right after the moratorium was lifted in August in Pennsylvania, we had a lot of filings right away, and then they kind of slowed down, and we've seen shorter timeframes than the 60 days. I think landlords are desperate to get their money, and we get it. There are a lot of small landlords that are struggling too, to pay their mortgages and keep their heads above water. We did have one landlord, a property manager of a bigger complex who, we were able to work out some agreements. They started referring families to us prior to filing. So we had 8 referrals from one landlord asking for help. I think the other lesson learned is we need more nimble, flexible financial assistance that meets and the emergency with a real sense of urgency. It's a big piece of it. That financial piece has to be free of onerous verification requirements, and we have to be able to deliver solutions in real time. We're in the process now of creating a policy where we may be able to pay landlords on site at court. I heard a saying that says a slow yes is worse than a quick no. So being able to say what we can and cannot do, having staff in court to say we're working on the settlement agreement is very different than saying, well, we'll work it out tomorrow and get back to you. It makes a huge difference for both the court and the landlord. And especially with the agreements, if we can settle it that day, we don't have to continue things. So court staff aren't creating continuance notices. Tenants don't have to take off of work to come back to court just to say that it was settled. So if we can pay, file the agreement and the dismissal on the same day, it's a win-win. And of course, you know, the one thing during COVID and social distancing, it's been really challenging in really small courtrooms. These are little local courts. And I will tell you that our very first day of court, we were doing intakes in the parking lot of the Downingtown District Court. So thanks.
Others who'd like to share some insights on lessons learned about eviction prevention strategies and the COVID-19 pandemic?
I guess I'll jump in. Sorry, Kyle. I think one of the biggest lessons learned at my level is the need, and just echoing Jennifer, the need for sustainable funding source. You know, although emergency rental assistance bill has been recently passed, it's not enough. And even when thinking about it, you know, we need sustainable funding in the midst of COVID and even after COVID. There has been a lot of programs that have been implemented during this time that needs to be sustained even after the crisis. And when you put the crisis into perspective, local governments are cutting their operational budgets. That means that it impacts programs, personnel that can help with it. Even community-based organizations, philanthropic dollars are limited, as well as federal dollars at this point in time. And so the need, as I was working with the cities over the last 12 months, at the end of the program, it was how can we develop a sustainable funding source to keep these programs alive? And that's the biggest lesson, because we need these programs going forward. Thank you.
I would echo what's been said about the need for funding, and particularly rental assistance. And then I would shift gears and say a couple of lessons that we've learned. I can sort of sum up in these two expressions that I'm sure everybody has heard. And one is, it takes a village. You know, this project that we're doing would not be possible were it not for this partnership of a lot of folks. You know, with the leadership of our city government, our organization, like I said, legal services organizations. We have housing counseling agencies. If anybody's not familiar with those are folks who are very familiar with the resources that might be available to tenants who are having financial difficulties. So, you know, trying to connect the tenants with those resources. The other expression is something that my mother used to say all the time: every cloud has a silver lining. And in a really weird way, COVID has, you know, this pandemic has provided an opportunity for us to, you know, push ourselves, see what we can do, think creatively, come up with solutions that we might not have thought of before. And it's just, you know, it's just weird that in the midst of this pandemic, we've created this, you know, this program that we hope to sustain and sort of shift or create a new normal in the world of eviction. Thanks.
Yeah, kind of echoing what Sue said, I think one of the most exciting things about the COVID time in the eviction space has been the kind of incubator it has proved to be for innovation because of the availability of funding. Here in Allegheny County, we've seen a number of startups, for lack of a better word, nonprofit startups pop up in the eviction space. Specifically, I would highlight Just Mediation, which is our local mediation program that really has gotten its legs during this time. And then also Rent Help PGH, which is the brainchild of Kara Hardiman, who's a local activist here in Allegheny County, kind of this service coordination, navigation of services, et cetera, that uses technology through Ann Wright at CMU to connect folks at high risk of eviction with resources. And I don't know if there would have been the funding and the interest in funding things like that outside of the COVID space. My hope is, as everyone else has echoed, that the innovation we've been able to toy with is sustainable. I also think in Allegheny County, we didn't have an infrastructure for a high volume rent relief program, as news articles will show you throughout the state. We now do. Urban League has done a phenomenal job as the primary implementer of rent relief programs previously, but it wasn't a high volume. And there's an understanding that there's a need for higher volume capacity, and we now have that. We will lose that if these programs don't continue to be funded, and if these innovations don't continue to receive the funding that is necessary. So that's what I think is we've really learned, is that we've been given this kind of test space to figure some stuff out. We just need to make sure that we really grab onto that infrastructure we've built across the areas and continue it past the crisis, so that we can continue to address the crisis that we all know already existed. It just now is much larger.
Thank you, everyone. And I will address, I think one of the themes is sustainable funding for these projects, going from the kind of the research and development phase or the piloting phase into sustainable and expandable, scalable programs. We have a number of specific concrete funding sources in Pennsylvania that can provide that funding for communities at different stages in different ways. Certainly at the state level, the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency has certain funding streams that it manages, like FAIR and Home for Good in the past, that may be part of this solution, that the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development manages the distribution of HUD emergency shelter grants that can be used for the rental assistance portion. And so as long as we're thinking about the guidelines, it's really important. And there's a bounty of funding from the federal government specifically to in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully that will continue and be part of the future ongoing funding landscape. In other words, more ongoing funding for rental assistance, eviction, homeless prevention, and the case management and services that need to go with that. But also many communities in the Commonwealth that are launching these innovative projects, whatever they are, around eviction prevention, are tapping into networks of private funding, particularly from foundations. And normally our pool is limited to foundations that provide grants related to ending or preventing homelessness or improving housing stability. But any projects that involve any sort of legal partnership open up another set of funders that fund legal aid, particularly community bar foundations, for example, who also maybe be able to provide some sort of pro bono attorney support, or at least be a bridge into and with the court system and the legal system. And I know, Jen, you've been successful even in your pilot work around leveraging, those public and private sources. Any insights to share?
I wasn't sure if you wanted me to talk. Yeah, I mean, I think that we've been able to, have a good mix of financial support from county government, but then also our local bar association. I think we have an application pending with the American Bar Association, so the national branch. And then, beyond the financial support was the consultation and the legal assistance. One of the pieces of advice that we got early on was to have a dedicated attorney for this, rather than, pro bono attorneys kind of filtering in and out. So we are in the process of hiring a staff attorney now that we've expanded, and we couldn't have done that or been able to navigate those complexities without those partnerships with the legal side of things. I think the American Bar Association, when we talked with them, they felt like having the court's involvement is that critical first step. So really getting the court on board was critical to making this project successful. And we have had nothing, of course, there were some bumps in the road, those first couple court sessions, trying to navigate, 29 people showing up at the same time, and then how that works week in and week out. But the judges have been overwhelmingly supportive of the efforts, and they've actually said it's made their job easier. One of the judges, and I don't think he would mind me telling the story, he's like, I'm a judge, I'm supposed to sit on the bench and be really neutral, but it's hard because tenants don't understand what's happening. And I'm really like walking that fine line of, trying to tell them what they need to do or what might happen next. And we've kind of taken that off their plate because we're there talking to them ahead of time. So it's really been a win-win situation for all involved.
And last year at Homes Within Reach, we had a discussion about a project called Epic in Montgomery County. It's part of the Your Way Home initiative, which is another court-based partnership intervention project, but utilizing the homeless service providers and partnership with the courts and legal aid organizations there in the Bar Foundation and Association. And that pilot started in Norristown because the data in Montgomery County said the highest concentration of evictions is in Norristown. So that was the place to start the pilot in the magisterial district courts. And then private funding was secured to hire from the HealthSpark Foundation to hire Villanova University to do an evaluation of the first year of that work, and also some other work. And there's a great study on the yourwayhome.org website documenting the how-to of an impact of that first year. Because of that data, Montgomery County was able to expand its program into 7 courts now. And so I want to make the link between sustainable funding and data. And it doesn't all have to be about this conversation around data doesn't have to be exclusive to court-based mediation projects, but the link between securing data and securing funding is how we're going to sustain these projects and grow them over time. So, could we talk a little about how data is being used to drive better planning decisions, projects, and securing funding?
I can get us started on that. Well, you saw the numbers for Philadelphia. Clearly something had to be done, and I'll say the tenant advocacy community has been trying for years and years and years to do something about this enormous number of eviction filings in Philadelphia. And the ideal thing, if you think about the fact that it's the filing causes this stain on the tenant's record, the ideal thing would be, how can we block that? And I'm speaking outside of my expertise, but my understanding is that became such a struggle that it just seemed to be, we're just not going to get anywhere with that fight. And so that was when the tenant advocacy community, or the eviction prevention community, I guess I should say, sort of shifted gears to say, well, how about we try to prevent the filings, excuse me, the filings in the first place. Then as far as the work we're doing now, I think it's important to look at what your goals are. The goal is to prevent an eviction filing, but beyond that, the reason you want to prevent a filing is to keep people housed, to make landlords whole to the extent that they can be, and to for the well-being of the whole community. And so we've sort of learned that it's important to frame our results in a way that address those goals. Thanks.
I think one thing here in the western half of the state, which I'm now just realizing I'm the only one on this side, we have had the privilege of having a Create Lab at Carnegie Mellon University, led by Ann Wright, who has really taken a strong interest in eviction prevention and has done a lot of pro bono data gathering that has been incredibly vital to encouraging and nurturing the funding community, both public and private, to invest in this area. We've also had the privilege of the Pittsburgh Foundation a few years ago took the initiative to bring Matthew Desmond to Allegheny County to do a talk, to organize a group of folks to discuss the eviction crisis, et cetera. I do think data is what is scaring people right now in COVID, but I think that people don't pay attention to the data pre-COVID, and my hope is that that changes post-COVID, because the numbers right now are terrifying here in Allegheny County and in the surrounding counties. And I'm sure that the same is true on the other side of the state and throughout the state. However, in the status quo, there are 10,000 eviction filings in Allegheny County. That is a lot for a county of 1.5 million people. We are not as big as Philadelphia, and I don't know the exact stats of Philadelphia's size, but I believe we are less than half the size of Philadelphia. Why are our eviction filings half of what Philadelphia's are? So, I mean, I think that, there is data out there that is problematic, that it's just a matter of having it accessible, which we've had, but also really pushing it into the spotlight so that folks outside of the advocate space see it and care about it. What we've seen is also really vital in the before times was landlord engagement. And when we were able to get landlords, obviously including Action Housing, though we are a bit of an anomaly, but including Action Housing and other major landlords, to become sympathetic and see the data and want to help us in elevating the use of the data to get funding. That's been incredibly effective. But it has taken that data to really get the landlords to see, like, oh, wow, this is an issue.
This was a challenging area for us, in prepping to start eviction court. We really did, want to look at the data and had to really dig through the court system to get it. So I think across the board, we need better data on all type of evictions. So we were able to get the filings and the orders of possession, but we really don't know, how many of those were for undesirable tenant, how many of those were just for non-payment of rent, what were the demographics of the people behind those filings and those evictions. So it's really critical, for us to have data on the types of evictions that we can focus our attention on getting the right tools to do this job of eviction prevention, while protecting privacy. So I know that's something that we, in these first couple of months, we're collecting it ourselves, kind of informally. I know that there was the Eviction Crisis Act of 2019 that was proposed in the Senate. That's kind of stalled out. And part of that package included improved data to better understand the national eviction crisis, expand the efforts to prevent eviction, and really probably tie some money into that. So it's really critical that we have a way to look at this and really look just beyond the filings and the orders of possession to see what's happening. And I think this really, as we talk about race equity, it leads into that as well, being able to look at the communities most impacted.
And just echoing, stepping back in the most basic sense, we need disaggregated data to really create that baseline to understanding the local eviction crisis. And it will help us to answer who, what, when, and where, and why. And with those answers, additional questions may be generated. But I will be honest, as we all know, there is not a uniform way of collecting data on evictions. And the process of collecting data is very cumbersome. But without starting, I think communities would not have the opportunity to understand what programs are effective or ineffective, what programs should be bolstered, how should outreach be enhanced and targeted, and how to really build a just and fair eviction prevention strategy. I think it's about starting, and by answering those basic questions, I think we would have a richer picture of our local eviction crisis.
And we're gonna continue. We're gonna move further into talking about some of those equity issues. Another data source that many communities are using in Pennsylvania is the United Way of Pennsylvania ALICE data. That stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained but Employed households. And actually, through their website, you can really drill down to what percent of the population, not only in any county, but in any major township or municipality, is in this new emerging category of working and still not being able to meet a reasonable housing budget. And that population is actually much larger than the population in any given community living in poverty. But when you combine them, many communities in the Commonwealth are looking at 30% or more of their residents not having a reasonable housing budget, paying more than 33% or 50% even of their monthly income on rent. So that information has been really compelling, because a lot of our systems for prevention and a lot of our funding sources have are really geared towards people living in extreme poverty, and in some cases have guideline restrictions around income. And more we're finding that's leaving out a portion of our population because they are making more than that, but they're not earning enough. And so that's, I think, adding another level to the challenge, but it's also coming forward because it's a data-driven level of analysis around ALICE. I do want to, you've touched on it, but we have a question. I want to make sure we're addressing our audience questions, and please keep them coming. I think it relates specifically to the eviction moratorium that's in place, and it's about the declaration form through the CDC moratorium. The question we're asking is if any of you have had experience with clients or participants or community members that have been trying to use the declaration form and hearing from landlords and courts landlords and courts are ignoring this form. Besides legal aid, are there any resources for tenants, perhaps fair housing organizations? Is this a problem you're encountering in your communities?
I can start. I mean, we kind of saw the CDC moratorium as like a blessing in disguise, because prior to it, landlords weren't filing. So we had no idea, how many were going to file, who was facing eviction. When the Pennsylvania moratorium was lifted, landlords were able to file. And then, of course, the affidavit came into place. So we were at least becoming aware through the filing. And then our attorney and our advocate on site, we have used the affidavit. So that's the first thing that we screen for. Are they eligible? And then we file the affidavit with the court. I think in Chester County, there was a memo that went out to all of the district courts, kind of instructing them on how to interpret the memo. It might have been through the AOPC, the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts, kind of went out throughout the Commonwealth directing, but then it's subject to interpretation by each district judge. We've filed them. By and large, the case would then be continued to January, now, but we continue to work with the tenant and with the hopes that by the time it was relisted, it would be resolved. There was a lot of confusion outside of us being able to navigate and assist with it. People on their own weren't doing it. They didn't understand what it was. And didn't understand where it had to be filed and who it had to be given to. I think landlords were confused. So, and I will say, outside of that, we have seen, we experienced some illegal evictions, some evictions not filed through the court system where a landlord just posted something on someone's door. So, and I think when people are in crisis and they're vulnerable and they're marginalized, they have a hard time, asking for the help because they're afraid. So I think that it has been a challenging situation.
I mean, I can say just real quick. I mean, one of the biggest, we have done a lot of attempts at educating and working with the magisterial district courts as well as the Court of Common Pleas. Our housing court Judge Connolly here in Allegheny County has been very good with working with the administrative director of the magisterial courts has been very good about reaching out to magistrates when there's been issues. There have been issues. That being said, the CDC order also, people refer to it as the eviction moratorium. It is a very narrow moratorium. It is so easy, and I say this as a landlord who has evicted people, it is so easy to throw in a second reason for eviction that then allows your eviction to move forward. Now, I will say, in this time, there have been legitimate things that have happened in the buildings under my legal jurisdiction that have been valid emergency reasons for eviction. That is a separate conversation than the person who has failure to pay and also their unit's a little bit dirty. And that's what we're seeing happen is all the landlord has to do is throw in a second reason and they're able to do that. We've even seen landlords do the thing where, noise complaints can lead to evictions. So what they're doing is they're calling noise complaints on their tenant. So I think, the issue we run into is that certain evictions are still able to get through. VAWA still exists. There are still those kind of protection for violence issues. So even when there was what I think was the good eviction moratorium in Allegheny County, which was the one that was issued pursuant to the Supreme Court order that allowed our local court to pretty much shut them down. People complained that, well, what about violence in our buildings? We were still able to get rid of violent actors because there are still federal laws that allow us to do that. That is what was needed. That is what continues to be needed in this time. So that's where I really see the weakness of the CDC order, because I know people who have used the declaration form, and so their landlord just amends their complaint and adds in that the person's noisy, and then the CDC order no longer matters. So that's where we really need better state and local action to actually protect people during this time, because the moratorium is not truly a moratorium.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Part of the Emergency Housing Protection Act that our city council passed sort of which was enacted before the CDC moratorium came out. And part of the act requires landlords to, even before they request mediation, first they need to send a notice to their tenants letting them know that they're going to be requesting mediation for this reason, and also providing the tenants with a form for the tenant to fill out, which is very similar to the CDC declaration form, in that it's a form in which the tenant says, I have experienced a COVID-related financial hardship, and then there's this whole list of what counts as a COVID-related financial hardship. And it's a very, I will say, thank you, Philadelphia. It's a very generous, it's a very broad list of what counts. So in Philadelphia, the burden was on the landlord to provide that opportunity to declare to the tenants. The burden is on the landlord, I should say. When the CDC declaration came around, quite honestly, we kind of ignored it because it flipped the burden onto the tenant and said, tenant, if this applies to you, you need to get this to your landlord. And, as everybody has pointed out, this causes all kinds of confusion and burdens on the tenants. They don't, who do I take it to? Where do I get the form? What do I do with it? So there was that. The other thing was that in Philadelphia, our understanding is that the declaration does not prevent a landlord from filing an eviction complaint. What it prevents is once the landlord has won possession of the unit in court, what the declaration prevents is it prevents the landlord from then, literally physically removing the tenant from the unit. So since our project is really focused on pre-filing and the moratorium as it's been, the declaration as it's been interpreted in Philadelphia is all the way at the other end of that whole process. like I said, we kind of ignore it.
So I do think some of the people in our audience are working in their community or their HUD Continuum of Care coordinated entry homeless and housing crisis response system. When they hear about, when they get a call from someone in crisis whose landlord is ignoring the declaration form or are threatening some sort of eviction, who can they refer them to beside community legal aid? Are there, in our communities, are there other resources to refer them to?
I think that depends on the city as well as the county. Like data, resources are not uniform. And I think it's a matter of each community sitting down and system mapping what resources are available and how to triage that information either through 311 or 211, at least in my experience working with cities across the country.
Yeah, in Philadelphia, I would, in terms of other resources, I would say we have two that just come to mind immediately. One is a tenant advocacy group that's called TURN, which stands for Tenant Union Representation Network, and they have workshops and hotlines, and they do not represent tenants in court, but many of their advocates are attorneys or other forms of legal advocates, and so they can help tenants with a range of things. And then the other the other thing we have is our Fair Housing Commission, which handles retaliation and repair issues and all sorts of other issues that aren't necessarily COVID related.
And we do have, I mean, in Pennsylvania, we have the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania and several fair housing organizations working regionally and statewide in support of tenants, and some of the questions that are starting to come in are around tenants' rights, tenant training. There are some great tools out there on understanding your rights as a tenant in Pennsylvania, as well as your rights as a landlord in Pennsylvania. On the other side of that equation, one of the questions, there's a couple questions we should address. For tenants who have eviction cases filed for cause other than insufficient income, is tenant training ever a requirement in the mediation process? And do we have sufficient resources for that tenant training? Does anyone can address that?
Let me see if I can get the question right. Basically, is there mediation training for the tenant on their rights? Yeah, that's actually something we're working. Just mediation in Allegheny County is new, but we are working on a partnership with Neighborhood Legal Services. It's controversial. I am of the mindset, and many others are of the mindset, that we don't want lawyers in the mediation, because once you have a tenant advocate in the mediation, I'm also there. And we don't want the landlord attorney to be present. But we are working with a partnership with Neighborhood Legal Services, where they will offer pre-mediation rundowns on what their basic rights are. And then we're also trying to build out a way that an attorney can then review the outcome of the document prior to its full execution, just to make sure that the tenant was not taken advantage of. So that is something that we're working to build out right now here in Allegheny County. Sue's going to be able to talk much better on this than me, because ours is brand new. Hers is also new, but much older than ours.
Well, for our current, for this particular project, all of the cases involve insufficient income. So it doesn't really relate to our Emergency Housing Protection Act eviction diversion project. Although when we started pre-filing landlord-tenant mediation back, in the fall of 2019, before the pandemic, part of what was built into that was, sort of exactly that, resources for the tenant to meet with. And in fact, it was through TURN, one of our partners there in that project was TURN, the agency that I just mentioned. So for that pilot project, whenever a case came in, we would match the tenant. We would send the tenant to TURN. We would match up the tenant with an advocate from TURN who would meet with the tenant before the mediation. We also, in collaboration with TURN and other legal resources, created a sort of cheat sheet, for lack of a better word, on rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants, which we sent out to both the landlord and the tenant before the mediation. One of the reasons we did that was, first of all, to sort of help us signal to the parties that we are really neutral in this. Look, here are rights and responsibilities of both landlords and tenants. We tried to make it even-handed. We were sure to have that available during the mediation session itself. We also either had the tenant advocate present at the mediation, and again, sort of framing it as a resource for the process, as opposed to a tenant advocate, but either available at the session or sort of on call, so that the tenant could take a timeout at any point in the mediation to consult with the tenant advocate. And similarly, we would offer the landlord an opportunity to take a timeout, should they so desire, to consult with their legal representative. If it was a smaller landlord who didn't have an attorney, we would refer them to the Philadelphia Bar Association's lawyer referral service.
Thank you both. There's another question around, how are you fielding evictions for individuals with sustainable, stable income, like SSI, SSDI, who are being evicted because they're using the moratorium as a reason for not paying rent? Are you seeing much of this?
So I speak as a landlord here. This is the most common argument used for why evictions are mandatory, why moratoriums are awful, is because tenants just refuse to pay rent. I can tell you, I have attempted to and moved towards eviction for people who just refuse to pay rent. They do exist. They are very much a minority. And they are not, you see this in the Pennsylvania legislature, when there's arguments around changes to the Landlord-Tenant Act, there are always state house reps who get down there and argue that landlords are being abused because tenants are refusing to pay their rent, even though they have the funds. I am the landlord for a large, highly marginalized group of people who are highly at risk. And I have seen 2 in my time out of all 3,500 who actually just refuse to pay rent. One of them, I have no idea why she refused to pay rent. It was confusing, it was baffling, but that is 1 out of 3,500 tenants each year over the last 5 years. That being said, I do know these people exist right now. We have one. The second one is someone who is in one of our buildings currently, who we know has not had a change in income, who refuses to pay. The CDC moratorium says explicitly that they are unable to pay rent, and they have to sign the affidavit that states that they are unable to pay rent and are making good faith efforts to get funding. If you are on SSI, you are not unable to pay rent because there's been no change in income. Therefore, the CDC moratorium does not cover you. How do you prove this? If someone's on SSI and you know it, and you're subsidized housing, you do income certifications annually, you have that information. So you can still move forward with eviction and still threaten it. And my guess would be that threat would potentially compel them to pay. So that's basically, I think what we are looking at is they're not technically covered. All you got to do is show that you can prove it, and then you can move forward with eviction. I also will tell you, and I love a lot of my landlord colleagues, some landlords are scared, they're desperate right now, and I get that, and they're pissed off, and that makes complete sense because you not paying rent is essentially them becoming unemployed, and that is tough, and that is hard, so they need resources. I don't think that the answer is talking about why the tenant's not paying. I think the answer is the landlord community is one of the only industries that was explicitly cut out of direct funding sources during COVID. And we are reliant completely upon the qualifications and efforts of another person we don't control to receive funding. People don't like giving money to landlords directly, but the landlord industry, I mean, we were cut out of PPE because, I'm sorry, PPP because of the Payroll Protection Act, because the belief was we would get the money through rent relief. That did not prove to be 100% true, but landlords could not tap into that resource because of this other resource. So we had to force our tenants to apply, some of whom did not qualify because of the burdensome requirements. So that's where I pushed legislatures to take knowledge of the fact that, to me, the best response to rent relief is to have two prongs. One where you give direct rent relief to tenants, and one where you give a forgivable mortgage product to landlords in exchange for forgiveness of rent. That's what should be happening. I would like to see that happening, and that's how I think you best address what the concern raised here is.
And are you seeing, this is another question, a related question. Is anyone seeing in their community landlords simply just not renewing leases when they expire as a way to change who their tenants are?
Absolutely. And I'll say locally, it was interpreted that the CDC moratorium did not cover end of lease term, which I think is a faulty interpretation of the CDC order. I'm not a judge, so I don't get to interpret that stuff. But that is something we are definitely seeing in Allegheny County, and it's a high concern.
We've also seen, and that's a difficult situation to be in, because we've had some where it's non-payment of rent and the lease is expiring. And so the landlord files and, you know, as trying to raise the funds and strategically use them in the best way. It's difficult to pay off that back rent if the person's going to have to move anyway. But we have been able to, you know, navigate with landlords, letting, you know, having the person agree to move and maybe moving them out sooner than the lease expires, so that they're not experiencing becoming unhoused. And the landlord is able to turn the property over. We haven't had a lot of them, but we have seen a few.
So as we're turning towards the last 20 minutes of our time for this summit, and I think I want to ask all of you, beginning with Lauren, about the fact that what we're hearing about are some very different approaches, right, in communities throughout the Commonwealth. There are court-based mediation, other forms of landlord-tenant mediation. There are rent subsidy projects. There are fair housing issues. One of the things that we were talking about in preparing for this session, and I think many of us here in our communities, is there's a lot of fragmentation around eviction prevention work. It's being done a little bit here. You may learn about it if you're lucky enough to be in a meeting or happen to tune into NPR when Jen is talking about her project. And there could be multiple things happening in any given community in the Commonwealth, but we don't have, for the most part, a holistic approach to dealing with eviction prevention at the community or county or even state level. So as a final pretty broad question, and we'll certainly continue to take other audience questions, could we end with talking about how to take two things, a more holistic and a more equitable approach to eviction prevention? And Lauren, maybe you could start us on that conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the main themes listening to everyone talk from the beginning of this conversation has been about partnership. Eviction prevention will not happen without partnerships. And when you're working with a stakeholder of community stakeholders, it's not just limited to a local government, or meaning city or county or village, depending on how it's formed. But it's also looking at how can we work with the courts? How can we strengthen that communication? How can we work with the sheriff's department? How can we work with legal aid societies? How can we work with community-based organizations? How can we work with anchor institutions such as universities and college? And by working together, you wouldn't necessarily see a duplicative process of programs that are fragmented are doing the same thing, but you really begin to see the strength of each organization when we're all talking together. While working on eviction prevention this year and working with city teams, what we saw is all these community stakeholders coming together to really build this just and fair eviction prevention strategy. And when everyone is on accord in talking, and I will mention, like, everything I said, it is difficult to break down silos. It's difficult to get people to listen and really focus on eliminating evictions, but you won't have that happen if you don't begin the conversation and if you don't begin to bring everyone around the table. And once you do that, you can have a more accurate picture of the eviction process. And I also want to include having tenants at the table and having landlords at the table. And that's very important, as well as what we know about housing, it has racial inequities in it, and, because of redlining, because of racial covenants, because of predatory lending, and because Black and Latinx households are twice as likely to rent, and there's a low home ownership rate, and they are more subject to eviction. It's important to have this whole ecosystem when trying to design an eviction prevention strategy.
I'm going to jump in really quickly to just, really reinforce what Lauren's saying. We definitely need to have the voices of people impacted at the table. We're creating a leadership/organizing program within our reentry house that we hopefully will expand across all programs, because we need to support the people most impacted. They need to be the ones in power. So they're speaking to legislators and commissioners. They're running for office. They're leading our agencies in this fight for equity. When we think about it, it's, we need to educate. People are not paying their rent because they don't want to. We have to look upstream. This is an upstream issue. Why are people not paying the rent? Well, they don't have a living wage. They've been incarcerated. They have health issues. Well, why do those conditions exist? Well, institutional and structural racism have been embedded in our economy, in all of our systems, in criminal justice, healthcare, child protective services, housing. The list goes on and on. If we achieve racial equity, hopefully we won't be talking about evictions. And as far as the partnerships, agreed. I mean, the last thing that someone who is on the verge of losing their housing needs is a list of referrals and instructions to go and find resources on their own. So really, the collaborations have to put the onus on the providers to navigate some of these I'd love to get rid of the complicated systems. Like, let's face it, that would be the first solution. But as long as we have them, we need to be there. It's far more helpful and successful in solving the housing crisis if we're the ones talking to each other and navigating. If we can set up hubs where renters can meet with more than one service provider at the same place in the court, where we're doing the heavy lifting to meet the demands of the emergency. I think that we found in our collaborations with the Housing Authority, who is administering the CARES Act funding, and other service providers that we've engaged, that we sit back after the fact and say, hey, didn't that make much more sense to do it this way? Didn't it expedite the whole process? And really, wasn't it a more dignified way to help people? So I think these relationships and collaborations are critical.
I truly can't add anything to what the two of you have just said, but I just wanted to sort of use this as an opportunity to mention that all of our mediators for the project that we're doing are volunteers. And we were able to recruit them from the sort of mediation community, the Philadelphia Bar Association's alternative dispute resolution community, and JAMS, which is an organization of sort of retired judges who work as mediators and arbitrators, and just, sort of to throw that into the mix of valuable partners in this kind of work and a potential resource for getting this work done and, bringing everybody together. But I would, just ditto to everything that Lauren and Jennifer said.
The one thing I kind of do want to add as well, I think, the equity conversation, I think, is so vital to effective eviction prevention strategy. Notably, we had 5 questions planned. That is the one question we cut. That, to me, in and of it, shows the priority being a little skewed. when we talk about having different voices at the table, it's also important that we know who we are to the table. I identified up front that I am the one person here who has evicted people. I'm also a cisgender white guy. In Allegheny County, we are a predominantly white county. The majority of landlords are white-led organizations or white individuals. The majority of evictions are against brown and Black communities. I have the privilege to be at this table. I have a Juris Doctorate. I have a master's degree. My husband and I own a home. I am not someone who is at high risk of eviction, but I am someone who is listened to on the topic of eviction by the judges and by the politicians in this region. I am also someone who has the power to remove people from their houses. And it's important that we know and are introspective about who we are to this table and ensure that we are talking to and engaging and empowering these other populations to have that same level of voice, because I've never been at risk of eviction in my life. There are people I have the privilege to work with who have been, and I need to make sure that I'm doing everything within my power to elevate their voice and to make sure that they have just as much say and power in this conversation as possible. And we in this space need to call each other out and be very comfortable calling each other out when we are not doing that. In 2020, the white community of America suddenly realized that racism exists. We can't let that be isolated to 2020. We need to continue this moving forward, especially when we're talking about something as complicated as eviction and something as racially skewed as the eviction crisis, and acknowledge who is at the table. Who are the people that were tapped to have this conversation, and who are the people being impacted by it? And that's really important that we are engaging and being very, very self-aware in that and doing what we can to ensure that the table is representative of whose voices need to be heard at this table.
Thanks, Kyle. That's greatly appreciated, and thank you for sharing that. We have to center equity in every, and I think it was centered in every question, but it needs to be first, second, third, and always when we're talking about any of these issues. So thank you for that. In terms of a holistic approach, I also want to contribute an observation, listening to all of you, that we're in the health and homelessness track affinity summit, but we've just had a conversation for the past hour and 20 minutes about how vital it is to have legal expertise, people who understand the law, understand eviction law in particular, people who understand navigating local court systems. And perhaps part of a holistic approach is having more public health, housing, and human service providers have legal expertise on their staff and on their board, and not to make sure they're adhering to their 501c3 governance charter, but to make sure that they understand how the legal system works and what impact it has on their mission. And so that's something when I've been working with organizations that have been fighting homelessness for 20 years, and rarely do I see a staff attorney. It's first of all, it's probably hard to afford, but second of all, I think it's just become increasingly important. And so maybe I'm challenging our sector and our organizations to think about a different kind of staffing capacity and a different kind of board capacity. And just to loop around another holistic answer, and Kyle, you and Lauren tapped into it, and yesterday I was in the audience for Joe Savage's discussion of housing equity with Angela Sustin from DCD, and he from USICH, talking about the importance of valuing people with lived expertise. And I want to, and you both said it, but one insight he had was the rest of us are being financially compensated to be part of this conversation. They are not. That, and I'm quoting him, pizza is not compensation. They should be financially compensated like any other consultant. So, we have a long way to go to make our eviction prevention work not only more equitable and more holistic. But I feel like you've helped us all see a little bit more of what is possible in communities throughout the Commonwealth. And now I'm going to surprise you with a final question that I did not prepare you for. It's February 1st, 2021. It's a little over 2 weeks from now. There's a new federal administration, and whether it's real or perceived to be universal, there is a CDC eviction moratorium, and it expires the day before, like it's set to on January 31st. What scares you most about evictions and eviction prevention on February 1st and beyond?
I mean, I have an immediate answer, which is looking at the immediate. I think there's long-term consequences, but the immediate is we have millions of dollars that have been allocated by Congress for rent relief programs. Here in Pennsylvania, we are looking at a program that may or may not launch until April, May, depending upon how quickly our government officials move. And I'm terrified that the eviction moratorium will end and we will not utilize these rent relief infrastructures that we built out to work efficiently to help these people, because the money is there. The government bureaucracy has the potential to stop the money from saving these individuals. I would actually, to give a call to action, Allegheny County, Philadelphia County, et cetera, those places will be getting the money directly so we can put pressure on our mayors, on our county executives, et cetera. But for the vast majority of Pennsylvanians, the money will be going to the state, and it's up to our legislature to make that decision and to implement that program. And the last I heard, State Senate has said they believe that they'll be able to get it up and running by April 1st. That is too late. We need to pressure the legislature across the state to prioritize this as soon as possible. Senate enters session next week. Contact your state senator. The Senate is really where the importance is. You want to get the state Senate on board because we believe that the House will be on board. Get the state Senate on board to prioritize the implementation of the emergency rental assistance program for the more rural parts of the state that make up the majority of our population. That is a vital, immediate need that the end of the eviction moratorium has a direct connection to.
In following along with Kyle's line, the last stimulus bill, and even prior to that, did not have aid to cities, particularly cities under the cap of 500,000. And if you were not a HUD entitlement city, you did not receive CDBG funding to even have rental assistance. So I think that it's very critical for this next stimulus package. If we don't have aid to cities under $500,000, just like how Kyle said, in terms of if you're not a large city, you have to wait on the state. I think that another call of action is reaching out to your Congress representative and asking for aid to local government, because there will be cuts, like I emphasized before. And if we don't have the money, programs, service providers may not have the funding, even though there is funding available. Just looking towards the future and how cities have begun cutting positions across the board, and specifically in housing and specifically in community development. And we know that city budgets are very limiting when it comes to housing and community development.
I am going to say that I'm going to predict that we're going to have another moratorium. But I think my biggest fear is, all of the things that Lauren and Kyle said, that we're not going to have an effective way to deliver the resources and the funding that's available. So we're just delaying the inevitable. So we need to get our act together and provide relief for people, whether that's a living wage, a universal income to see this through, so that people aren't having to worry about this, whether it's a tenant or a landlord who's struggling. We can do another moratorium, but if people aren't getting the assistance, then we're just delaying this by however many months the next moratorium is. So that's my biggest fear, is that we're not going to get it together.
The only thing I would add, as I sort of pointed out earlier, it's not the CDC moratorium, but our local ordinance, which runs through March. And so, like Jennifer, I'm optimistic that it will be extended. But if it's not, my biggest fear is maintaining the momentum to make pre-filing mediation the new normal in the world of landlord-tenant.
And one more thing that I'd like to say is, a call out for mutual aid. For those of us that got a stimulus check that we don't need, let's get it to somebody that really needs it.
I think just to add to our fear, and then we'll try to end on a note of hope, is the fact that in many communities through the Commonwealth, we're continuing to see a dramatic increase in the housing rental market. In other words, it's a really good market in a lot of places, and that adds a dimension, I think, to the complexity of the challenge that we all have to face. But what I'm hopeful about, is the kind of projects, insights, data, and commitment and passion that all of you have shared with us. And we know you're representing much, much larger, complex public-private partnerships that are working throughout the Commonwealth to really build those sustainable, equitable solutions to the eviction crisis that we're experiencing. So there's more to come. I'm confident we'll be reconvening at Homes Within Reach 2022 to celebrate even more success in this work, but also continue to deepen our knowledge of the root causes of the solutions to the eviction crisis in Pennsylvania. So I can't ask for a loud applause from the audience, but you all certainly deserve one. So I want to thank you, Lauren, Sue, Jen, Kyle, and a little bit extra, Jen, for apparently pinch hitting for me when I dropped out for a few minutes at the beginning. But I'm grateful to all of you for this conversation, and I'm grateful for the work being done by the people in our audience who are also working on this issue in their communities. So thank you all. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the Homes Within Reach conference. And my gratitude to the Housing Alliance for being our statewide advocacy organization and leaning on our legislators to do what is best for our communities and our residents. Thank you and have a great day.